Praise the Lord. I'm so glad you've taken the time to join me. I'm excited today as my latest book, Elevate From Perdition to Providence, uh, is just being released. Just taking a moment to welcome you to this reading as we introduce the book to you, as we tease you a little bit about what we think will one day make an incredible motion picture, series of pictures that we are planning, screenplays, and of course, talking to those people that produce these types of things. And we believe God has put his hand on this project. Oops, guess what? Where's the microphone?
Oh, it's coming from the.
Okay.
You're good.
Let me start over because I put my own mic on.
Well, you're live, so.
You know, make sure it's not on. Okay. Yeah, I put my own on, but I wasn't sure how we were going to do it.
So you can continue. You're live now.
Okay. Praise the Lord. I'm so glad you took the time to join me today. Welcome as we are going to share with you uh, our new book called Elevate From Perdition to Providence. I'm hoping you're going to become interested in this project. We're excited about what God is doing with it. Uh, it looks like there'll be a series of 5 books. You want to get right in at the beginning and start to follow this story of David in very contemporary and relevant times. The book is called Elevate. I'm Bishop David Evans, and I want to welcome you to this time where we're going to read together. I feel like a grandfather reading to some of his grandchildren, or a father reading to some of his children, or just a group of friends that have gathered together that we might hear. I want you to join me always on Facebook at David G. Evans 1. But if you want to pre-order this book, it's still in pre-order, so we can get it to you at a very discounted rate, $15. You can do that at my website, davidgevans.com, davidgevans.com. All right, let's get into Elevate. The book begins in the present day. The prison gate slammed shut with the loud and definitive smack of solid metal on metal. Thick walls of concrete and steel suggested there was no escape, no matter who you were on the outside. The idea of escape would be tested now that the powerful David Shepard was on the inside. Sitting behind bulletproof glass, the guard gave a curt nod of greeting and returned to his newspaper, which was peppered with salacious headlines about the man he was watching. He looked confident and relaxed. Nathan Gates nodded back and then grimaced as he turned his attention to the long hall of barred doors and cold, smooth cement floors. The psychiatric block of Providence City Detention was mostly empty that evening, except for a few homeless sleeping off the voices in their heads and his patient in the cell in the farthest corner. Nathan's shoes gave off a squeak with every step, announcing his arrival as it cut through the unnatural silence in the large, barren room. He tried to walk differently, but it only seemed to make more noise, bringing more attention to him. Quiet, shouted one of the homeless from his cell. Quiet, quiet, quiet. We must be quiet. He kept repeating each time in a different voice until he settled back into sleep. The smell of these halls was different from elsewhere in the compound. It smelled too clean, almost over-sterilized like an operating room. The lights also reminded Nathan of the overhead lights guiding a surgeon. They were too bright, exposing every scar of missing paint on the steel bars. Every corner was illuminated and was disturbing in its clarity. The lighting suggested a view into the very soul of everyone who walked the halls. Nathan shuffled his files awkwardly from arm to arm, trying once more to glance at the notes he hastily made before running down here to the prison. This wasn't really his beat. He was on a staff chaplain for the prison wing of the facility. He was on the staff chaplain staff, a job that mostly involved working in the same criminal. How can I do this? I need to go back.
Okay. You're live, so people can see you.
I know.
Okay.
Nathan shuffled his files awkwardly from arm to arm, trying once more to glance at the notes he'd hastily made before running down here. This wasn't really his beat. He was the on-staff chaplain for the prison wing of the facility, a job that mostly involved working with the same criminals in the dingier end of the compound. The sane and secretly contrite were his specialty. He had a profound ability to push past those things that resisted repentance. Most of his days were spent comforting the sinner as their guilt and the reality of their punishment hit them, like the thud of the metal doors closing in on them. He was used to praying for murderers and rapists and thieves, or otherwise just listening and trying to draw those left behind toward the light and away from the darkness of their crime and punishment. The light in the criminal wing was almost inviting, a place where a man might whisper his shame and allow his soul to be cleansed. He had baptized lifelong offenders in the warm light. He had helped violent, savage men let them cry and beg for the Lord's love. It was hard work, but it was what he was born to do. Nathan was a good listener, and a broken man needs nothing more than a listening ear. It can take a while to realize that God is listening too. That was Nathan's true role, to gain their trust and to help them realize the divine grace waiting for them when they opened their hearts. It was noble and important work, and Nathan loved it. In a literal sense, he was made for this work. He was truly his father's son, even if he was a complete opposite in every sense. Samuel Gates, his dad, had been tall and strong, with a deep, bold voice that commanded his whole church. Everything about Nathan's physical character was made for more intimate settings and suggested a man who could be trusted. He was a listener, a man who wanted to hear it all, a real confidant. He was small and non-threatening with large, believing eyes. A small, quiet mouth and crooked teeth made him approachable and non-threatening. Despite the disappointment his quiet nature and soft appearance gave his father, Nathan believed his way was a cornerstone of his faith. God had designed him for this purpose, to listen, to offer comfort to the most vulnerable of his flock. Shortly after his 40th birthday and his father's death, he enrolled in Providence City University to become a psychologist. His only motivation for this midlife move was to follow God's calling on his life, to be a better listener and to present God's forgiveness to his lost sheep. He certainly had never dreamed it would lead to this, a long walk down a prison hallway to interview David Shepard, a man so powerful he had been allowed to rename the whole city. Shepard had turned a ghetto into a world-famous business district, safe to walk at all hours, full of skyscrapers, well-lit streets full of cafes and expensive shops. Here sat a man who had been, by sheer force of will, changed his entire world in 30 years. Nathan was tasked with finding out if this man of power was insane or simply a cold, unrepentant murderer. Nathan had never wanted to do anything of this magnitude with such high stakes on such a big stage. Politics had been his father's business, not his. He was only interested in the soul. But here he was, and he had run out of hallway to find an excuse to back out. At the cell door, Police Chief Derek Abrams stood with the key, offering another confident nod, a nod that once again told which side of the bars he planned to stay on. I think you know, he said with a meaningful look behind his tired, droopy eyes, just how serious this is. Nathan nodded in turn. Perhaps then you ought to find someone more qualified. Chief Abrams shook his head. He refuses to see a psychiatrist, any of them. The mayor offered to send for some fancy ones from Harvard or Yale or one of those phony ones on TV. He won't have it, says he doesn't trust any of them. And he's got enough strings he can still pull that he's going to get his way on this too. So why not put him with the regular criminals then? Why not put him in with the population? Can't do that either. Imagine the scandal if he does turn out to be mentally incapacitated. And then those boys on the other side are rough, liable to start a fight. A few of them probably hold quite a grudge against the man, who got rid of the street gangs and put most of them behind bars. Shepard is supposed to be pretty tough. I'm not worried about Shepard. Imagine the headlines if I got a bloodbath in my cells with half the untried criminals in the emergency room. Politics, Nathan winced. His father would have known how to handle this situation. He exuded power. No one would undermine his authority. He wished he could reach out to the loved Reverend for advice. David Shepard sat upright and statuesque in his cell, staring out the small window opposite his cot. Even dressed in a baggy orange jumpsuit, something powerful and authoritative emanated from this man. Age had begun to draw lines through his famous, handsome features, but he was still arresting to look at, as dignified as a president. His intense blue eyes, so striking in contrast to his dark features, held Nathan's attention, even as they made no effort to connect. They were wise eyes, knowing eyes that had clearly seen a lot, even if they stared off distantly now. They also were somehow tough and compassionate eyes, the sort of eyes Nathan assumed battle-weary generals had at the end of their glorious campaigns. Eyes that had set out to see much and to see much change and had seen it all, were tired and ready to close. Nathan felt the trap of those eyes, sensing instinctively that the stories of this man almost mystical appeal, the loyalty he inspired, the love he courted, the ruin he could bring, all came down to the force behind those eyes. Nathan sighed. So what do you want me to do? Just what you always do, answered the police chief. Sit down, have a chat. Talk about God, find out what the man wants to confess. And then come tell me whether he's kooky as the papers claim, or if he's a cold-blooded killer. Or if he seems something different, Nathan added. Chief Abrams nodded. Or if he's something entirely different. Chief Abrams unlocked the door and allowed Nathan to sidle in. He was noticeably startled by the definitive turning of the key in the lock. I'll be back in a few hours, said Chief Abrams, already moving off down the hallway. Call if you need anything. There's a guard at the far gate. Well, as the sound of Chief Abrams' footsteps receded, Nathan questioned whether his shouts would be heard or heard in time to do any good. He was alone now with the most impressive man ever born in this city, a man whose physical strength was daunting even in his mid-50s, a man who had earned billions, a man who had fought his way up from nothing, a man with world leaders on speed dial, a man with his face gracing magazines on every rack. He was alone with a murderer, David Shepard. It would be the interview of his life. Take a seat, he said without looking away from his window. With nowhere else to sit, Nathan placed his files and then himself down on the opposite end of the cot. You're a pastor, he said. David smiled slightly. Good. But I only have a master's in psychology. I'm really not qualified to judge this case. Judge what about this case? Nathan looked away through the bars, half embarrassed, half fearful. He had sat at perfect ease with the most dangerous man in Providence, but now he was for some reason awkward and feeling uncertain. The word awestruck, in its original sense, came to mind. David Shepard struck him with fear and wonder, with nearly divine awe. Luckily, David let him off on his answer with a soft, melodious chuckle. I'm not crazy, he said. But I'm not crazy in a way only a man of God can understand. There are plenty of godly psychiatrists. David waved this off. But there are people of the mind first. There are people of the mind first. Where their science ends, only can God begin. I need a man who is a person of faith first to understand my story. Nathan considered carefully. The logic was sound enough, a point for sanity, but he still felt uncertain how to proceed. What good could a man of faith do before the scandalous trial certain to follow, David's son's accusations. Okay, he said tentatively, but before we begin, I need you to answer one question completely honestly. He rapped on the pile of files between them. Did you really do all this? For the first time, David Shepard's eyes wandered from the window, floating with the death sharpness of a sword aiming for the heart. As though piercing blue eyes fell on him, as those eyes fell on him, Nathan felt himself warm under their gaze. He thought of all the stories he had heard about the man who analyzed him now. David the killer, David the con man, David the philanderer, David the heretic. And then the stories he had heard from his father, David the savior, David the warrior for good, David the protector. And with those ideas competing for attention, he wished now he hadn't begun with this question. He didn't want an answer. He wished only that David's eyes would move off him again. He felt exposed by those eyes, even more than by the bright overhead light. Yes, was the answer after some time. But that isn't the question. That's not the question. It isn't a matter of what I've done. It's a matter of why. I need you to understand that all of this here, he tapped on the files himself, was inevitable. It had to happen. There was no choice in it. I am a vessel meant for greatness. It was inevitable as you sitting next to me right now. Perhaps he was mad after all, Nathan thought. Instinctively, Nathan moved closer to the edge of the clock. He moved closer to the edge of the clock, closer to the cell door. How long would it take for his shout to reach the guard and get to the door and get it open? Too long if the guard would even respond. Nathan wasn't sure he himself would if he were the guard. I'm not sure I'd come if I were him. The risk was too great. Entering a cage with a man as dangerous as David Shepard. And even if he could pacify the man, the consequences of that could be brutal as well. David the killer, David the corrupter, David who has all of Providence in his pocket. But David didn't seem to realize or recognize the pastor's distress. His gaze had returned to the window. The construction site out there, he motioned out the window. It meant to be a church. That construction site, it's meant to be a church. The clear patch of ground was just barely visible in the dusk of the autumn evening. On either side of it were lines of trees, one of the improvements David had made to the city. Full of parks now, most of them named after David, ordained by him. In contrast, the construction site was a mucky, muddy mess with material scattered all about, derelict and half buried by the long delays that had held up construction. The biggest on the coast, I heard, answered Nathan at last. The biggest in the country when it's done. But I will never see it. Prison won't mean all your assets are necessarily frozen, comforted Nathan. It could be done by your first parole. No, said the businessman. And the issues with your son's takeover. None of that matters. I am not to see my church, my greatest achievement. That too is inevitable. I don't understand, said Nathan. No, not yet. But we have time to change that. There was a pause as David seemed to turn inward, forgetting the man sitting next to him. After a moment's hesitation, Nathan decided the pen in his pocket wasn't a weapon enough to worry about, and took it out and clicked the top as he pulled out a fresh notebook from among his files. That click awoke David, whose eyes cleared of their sternness for a moment as he gave a friendly glance to his interviewer. I knew your father. He could have such a soft voice when he wanted. After seeing David the killer, it was fascinating now to see David the charmer, or to be charmed despite himself. But Nathan was not going to be overwhelmed by a connection to his father. I know. We weren't close, he answered as tersely as he could, which was not very terse at all. I wasn't close with mine either. Doesn't change things. We end up being like our fathers regardless of whether we like it or not. My father was a tough man. He came from a tough time. If it wasn't for him, it'd still be a tough time. He was the only source of God and peace in the whole city. Nathan considered David's words, decided to pocket the idea, and pursued down the same path. How are you like your father? Now it was David who considered, who gave the question due weight. He wanted to be a good man, I think, but life was too complicated for him. I think we share that, a love of family too, and an incredible ability to mess that family up. Did you love your father, Nathan continued his questioning. I always loved my father. But Jesse Shepherd is not where my story starts. With your brother? With Aaron, yes, but he hesitated, swallowing hard. I'd rather not start there either. They sat together. Nathan had learned the value of silence in letting a person think. He scribbled a few idle notes now and again and waited, watching the last light of the evening sun disappear over the horizon and the orange light run slowly down the cell wall. He wondered what David Shepard's life was like outside the cell. A man with 4 wives, numerous children, a business that earned billions. An article last year had questioned whether he ought to run for office, for president even. What was it like to be a man so powerful and yet so clearly troubled? Did all the glitz of his homes, of his travel to faraway locations, of his beautiful women and devoted fans, did all that make up for what he saw when he was alone? Nathan paged through the file quietly. So much horror to hold inside on those quiet nights alone. My story begins in 1981, said David suddenly. Occasional swoosh of a passing car marked out how alone they were. But now Nathan wasn't scared. He had been drawn into the man despite his attempts to keep his distance. It begins on these very streets, before the skyscrapers, when they were run down and dangerous and had different names. That was when I discovered my destiny. I didn't know it then, but that's when God chose me, for better or for worse. That was chapter 1 of Elevate. You might want to pre-order the book. It gets better and better and better. The tension builds. We're watching David from the Bible, from an old man all the way back to his youth. This is the first in a series of 5. So won't you go to my website, davidgevans.com, and pre-order, $5 discount. It'll be $20 after the pre-order sale is over. You can get it for $15 and change. Pretty good deal for a wonderful writing experience. Thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you real soon.